He leaned in and whispered, "Try not to embarrass me. These people are way above your level." I didn't say a word, I just walked in beside him, but when the host rushed over, shook my hand, and said, "We've all been waiting to meet you." His face went pale so fast it was almost satisfying. I had to bite back a smile as I greeted James Whitmore, the man who, in that moment, had unknowingly shattered my husband's carefully constructed world. Daniel had spent the last 3 weeks preparing me for this night, offering unsolicited advice on everything from my hair to my posture, and how to be the perfect accessory to his ambition. I was supposed to blend in, smile, and let him handle the conversations. After all, he was the one with the real power, wasn't he? But as I stood there, with James Whitmore's hand in mine, and the guests around us whispering in excited recognition, it was impossible to ignore the truth. They weren't waiting for Daniel. They were waiting for me. Daniel had told me, more than once, that I wasn't meant for this world. Not really. These people, he'd said, referring to the wealthy and influential guests of the evening. They don't have time for someone like you. He meant it like a compliment, as if he was doing me a favor by introducing me to a world that seemed so far out of my reach. He never saw the value in what I did, never understood the dedication and expertise it took to transform a crumbling historical building into something beautiful. My work wasn't glamorous. It didn't fit his image of success. I was a historic preservation architect, and to most people, that was a profession they couldn't quite wrap their heads around. They'd nod politely when I explained what I did, but didn't really understand the skill and effort involved in saving structures that were decades, sometimes centuries old. I didn't design sleek skyscrapers or trendy new developments. I didn't build houses for the suburban elite. I saved the forgotten spaces, the old theaters, the abandoned factories, the historic mansions no one cared about anymore. And yet, my work had garnered attention. I had won awards. I had been featured in industry magazines. But to Daniel, that was secondary. He saw me as a woman who needed his guidance to navigate his high-powered social circles. His friends, his colleagues, they were above me. We had been married for 3 years, but I couldn't remember the last time he'd shown any genuine interest in what I did. It wasn't just tonight. It had been happening for months, even years. He'd barely acknowledged the long hours I put into my projects, the nights I stayed up late drafting plans, or troubleshooting problems on site. He'd never come to see my work in person, never asked about the latest renovation I was leading. His questions about my career were always vague, like he was trying to check it off a list. "How's the job going?" He'd ask casually, as though it wasn't the thing I dedicated my entire life to. But tonight, as I stood beside him, watching the guests approach me with a mixture of admiration and awe, I realized that this world, this high society world, had always been mine to navigate on my own terms. I had just been letting him lead. "Are you okay?" Daniel's voice cut through my thoughts. He was standing a few feet away, looking more nervous than I'd ever seen him, trying to position himself for a conversation with someone across the room. I gave him a quick glance and nodded, though I didn't feel okay. How could I? When the man who claimed to love me had spent our entire relationship seeing me as something to be managed and hidden. How could I feel anything but conflicted? The evening went on, and the tension in the air was thick enough to be cut with a knife. I couldn't help but notice the subtle glances Daniel threw in my direction, as if waiting for me to fail, waiting for me to fall into the role he had created for me. But I didn't. I smiled, I nodded, and I spoke when spoken to. The guests seemed pleased with my responses, appreciative of the expertise I shared about historic preservation, and every time I looked at Daniel, I saw his face grow more and more pale. James Whitmore introduced me to the group, and I felt a strange sense of satisfaction when he said, "We've all been waiting to meet you." I could feel the room shift as people took notice, as the truth of my accomplishments became evident. My husband, the man who had never truly seen me, was now standing in the shadows of the reputation I had built, one he never bothered to understand. I didn't feel bad for him. Not anymore. The years of self-doubt and quiet resignation had melted away in the warmth of the recognition I was receiving. It wasn't that I wanted to embarrass him, but I wanted him to see. I wanted him to realize that I had always been enough, that the life we had built together wasn't just his, but mine too. And maybe, just maybe, it was time for him to start recognizing it. As the night wore on, I could feel a subtle shift in the room, a change that could no longer be ignored. For once, Daniel wasn't the one everyone was looking at. It was me, and it felt good. The dinner was everything Daniel had promised it would be: elegant, sophisticated, and completely out of my comfort zone. The chandelier overhead glittered like diamonds, casting warm light over the table set with crystal glasses and fine china. The scent of expensive food mixed with the faint aroma of the flowers arranged in the center of the table. The guests, an assortment of financiers, entrepreneurs, and socialites, milled around the room in clusters, their voices a soft murmur, as they exchanged pleasantries, talking about everything from global markets to the latest art exhibitions. Daniel, of course, was in his element. He had been preparing for this moment for weeks. His suit fit perfectly, his watch gleaming in the light, as he gestured animatedly during a conversation with someone I didn't recognize. His posture was impeccable, his words smooth, rehearsed, and confident. Every glance he threw at me seemed to say the same thing. "Remember what we talked about. Don't mess this up." I smiled and nodded, just as he had instructed. I smiled at the guests who asked about my work, keeping my answers brief and general. "Wes, I specialize in historic preservation," I said more than once. "It's a lot of work, but it's very rewarding." I could feel Daniel's eyes on me whenever I spoke, his lips barely moving in a silent reminder to keep it simple, to keep it short. No one needed to know the depth of my expertise, the long hours I spent restoring the crumbling facades of old buildings, or the awards I had won. It was easier for him if I stayed in the background, if my career remained something that didn't make waves. As the evening wore on, I felt a growing disconnect between myself and the people around me. They were all so polished, so perfectly put together. Their conversations danced around topics I knew nothing about: new investments, luxury properties, exotic vacations. I was used to being on job sites, covered in dust, talking about structural integrity and appropriate materials. I was used to finding solutions to problems that no one else seemed to care about. like restoring a crumbling theater, or preserving the original moldings in a century-old mansion. The more I listened to the guests around me, the more I realized just how out of place I felt. The irony was impossible to ignore. Here I was, at a dinner meant to elevate Daniel's social standing, but my mind kept wandering back to the Whitmore estate. The one project Daniel knew so little about. I had spent months working with James Whitmore, carefully navigating the complexities of the historic building while maintaining its integrity. Yet, Daniel had never asked a single question about the project. He had never shown any interest in the details, never wanted to understand the intricacies of the work that was consuming my life. I glanced across the room and saw him, standing tall and confident as always, the center of attention. He was surrounded by men in expensive suits, their laughter ringing out across the room. Daniel was in his element, and yet, for the first time, I saw him for what he truly was, someone who was trying so desperately to prove that he was important, to prove that he was worthy of the same admiration he so readily gave to others. I wondered, for the first time, if he even saw me, or if I was simply another accessory in his carefully curated life. It wasn't until James Whitmore approached me that I realized just how much I had been underestimated. He greeted me like an old friend, shaking my hand warmly and smiling like we had known each other for years. "I've been telling everyone you'd be here tonight," he said, his voice filled with excitement. "We've all been waiting to meet you." I felt the weight of Daniel's gaze on me, but I didn't look at him. Instead, I turned my attention to James, whose enthusiasm was a sharp contrast to the cool indifference Daniel had shown me for months. James spoke highly of the Whitmore estate project, of the work I had done, of the attention to detail I had put into every aspect of the restoration. I could see the looks of surprise on the faces of the guests as James spoke, their eyes darting between me and Daniel, as if trying to make sense of the disconnect between the two of us. Daniel's face went pale, almost imperceptibly, as the realization hit him. The carefully curated world he had built was crumbling around him, and I was at the center of it. I couldn't help but feel a flicker of satisfaction. For the first time, I wasn't the one in the background, the one who had to apologize for my success. I wasn't the one who had to shrink myself down to fit into his version of what our life should be. Tonight, I was the one people were excited to meet. Tonight, I was the one with something to offer. The guests continued to gather around, engaging me in conversation, asking about my work, eager to learn more. Daniel, standing a few feet away, tried to insert himself into the conversations, but it was clear he wasn't being heard. His questions about market trends and investments were met with polite nods, but it was me they wanted to talk to. It was me they were interested in. The dinner carried on, but I felt an unfamiliar sense of freedom. For the first time, I wasn't playing a role. I wasn't pretending to be someone. I wasn't for the sake of Daniel's ego. I was just me, and that was enough. The rest of the evening passed in a haze of polite conversations and forced smiles. Daniel was the same, charming, polished, and entirely unaware of the shifting dynamics around us. He moved from one group to the next with practiced ease, steering conversations to topics he knew would make him look good. He was in his element, while I was left behind, drifting between brief exchanges, smiling and nodding, only half present in a world that never quite felt like mine. As the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. I'd seen it in the eyes of the guests, the subtle glances of curiosity, the faint recognition, when they heard my name. It was as if the air around me had changed, and for once, I wasn't being overlooked. Yet, despite the attention, there was a nagging sense of discomfort, something I couldn't quite place. Maybe it was the way Daniel kept his distance, eyes darting nervously between me and the guests. Or maybe it was the fact that he had yet to speak a word about the work I'd done on the Whitmore estate, the project I had poured months into, the one that had brought me to the attention of these very people. Instead, he was too busy trying to maneuver through the room, positioning himself like a player in a game, each handshake a step toward his own ambition. I caught a glimpse of him across the room, speaking with someone I didn't recognize, his voice carrying the same polished confidence he'd worn for years. But as I stood there, watching him, I began to notice something. His gestures were rehearsed, his words carefully measured, as if he were constantly trying to impress, constantly trying to prove something. It was exhausting, and I wondered for the first time if he ever truly stopped to think about what he was trying to prove or why. The thought lingered as I excused myself from another conversation. The weight of the evening felt heavier now, like a mask I was wearing too long. I stepped out onto the balcony for a breath of fresh air, the cool night air a sharp contrast to the warmth of the room inside. The city stretched out before me, its lights twinkling in the distance. A world that seemed so far away from the one I was expected to inhabit tonight. I leaned against the railing, letting the breeze ruffle my hair, trying to gather my thoughts. What was it that had been gnawing at me? I couldn't quite explain it, but I had the distinct feeling that tonight was more than just a dinner. It was a turning point. It wasn't just the way the guests had recognized me, or the way Daniel had slowly become a background figure in his own narrative. It was something deeper, something I'd been too afraid to admit until now. For years, I had let Daniel define who I was in his world. I had bent myself to fit the mold he had created for us, always the supportive wife, always the one who stood by while he chased after his ambitions, quietly tending to my own career in the background. I had accepted the role he assigned me, believing that it was the only way to keep our life balanced, to make everything work. But tonight, something had shifted. The world I had been hiding from had started to see me. And the worst part, I realized that I had been hiding from it too. I wasn't just Daniel's wife. I wasn't just the woman he coached on how to act at events or what to wear to fit into his world. I was someone in my own right, someone who had built something meaningful with my own two hands. With the sweat and tears of a career I had worked relentlessly to create. I wasn't just an accessory to his success. I had my own success, and it was time I acknowledged it. But I didn't know how to tell him. How could I? For 3 years, I had let him treat me like a child, like someone incapable of standing on her own. He didn't know the first thing about what I did, and I had never tried to make him understand. I had always excused his indifference, always told myself it was just the way he was. But tonight, standing in the midst of people who knew exactly who I was and what I had accomplished, I couldn't keep lying to myself any longer. I heard the sound of footsteps behind me, and I turned to find Daniel standing there, looking a little lost. His posture was stiff, his eyes scanning the horizon as if trying to find something familiar in the unfamiliar surroundings. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The words I wanted to say were trapped somewhere deep inside me, tangled up in a mess of frustration, hurt, and anger. How could he have never seen me? How could he have spent all this time looking past my accomplishments, dismissing my work as insignificant, while all along, it was the very thing that could have made him proud? "I'm fine," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. "Just needed some air." He nodded but didn't move. Instead, he stood beside me, his gaze following mine as we both stared out at the city below. The silence between us felt heavy, filled with all the things that had gone unspoken for so long. There was so much I wanted to say to him, so much I needed to say, but I couldn't bring myself to do it here. Not in the middle of a party. Not with the weight of all these eyes on me. I didn't know what would happen when the night was over. When we went back to our hotel room. When we faced each other with no more distractions. But I knew one thing for certain. I was done pretending. Done pretending that my work wasn't worthy of respect. Done pretending that I needed him to navigate this world. Tonight had shown me something. Something I'd been too scared to see. I didn't need him to validate me. I was already enough. The dinner continued inside, but I stayed on the balcony, taking in the cool night air, savoring the clarity that had finally settled in my chest. The evening wore on, and the gap between Daniel and me grew wider with every passing minute. While the guests continued to mingle and laugh, discussing everything from wine pairings to their latest investments, I found myself slipping further into the background, just as Daniel had always expected. But this time, it didn't feel the same. I wasn't just playing my part, I was quietly observing, absorbing the atmosphere, with a growing sense of detachment. The soft clink of glasses and the hum of conversations filled the air around me, but I felt like I was on the outside looking in. I had spent years trying to fit into the mold Daniel had crafted for us, playing the supportive wife, never challenging him, always staying quiet about my own achievements. But tonight, I felt something inside me shift, something I couldn't ignore anymore. I watched Daniel as he made his rounds. His posture was straight, his smile just right, but his eyes darted around the room, always calculating, always searching for the next person to impress. It was as if he couldn't just exist in a space. He had to dominate it. I couldn't understand why, but in that moment, it became painfully clear. Everything he had built was based on appearances, on external validation. Nothing had ever been real, not with him, not with the life we had created together. I glanced around the room at the guests. They were all so sure of themselves, so comfortable in their wealth and status. I had often imagined that world, dreamed of what it would be like to belong to it. But as I stood there, surrounded by all this wealth, all this prestige, I realized I wasn't the one who didn't fit in. It was Daniel. He hadn't even noticed it yet, but the tide was already shifting. The guests had stopped looking at him, They were looking at me now. And it wasn't just because of the way I looked elegant in the dress Daniel had insisted I wear, my hair styled in a way that felt foreign to me. It was because of the work I had done, the history I had preserved, the things that couldn't be measured by the labels on my clothes or the shine of my jewelry. I felt a sudden surge of pride. Despite everything, despite the years of doubt and the constant undermining, I had built something real. The Whitmore estate was mine. It had my fingerprints all over it, from the delicate restoration of the marble floors to the painstaking work I had done on the original crown molding. The guests had seen that in me. They didn't need to be told what I did. They knew, instinctively, that I was the one who had transformed that old mansion into the stunning venue it had become. They were drawn to the authenticity of my work, something that Daniel had never been able to appreciate. "Lucy, over here." The voice pulled me from my thoughts, and I turned to see James Whitmore waving me over. He was standing with a group of people, all of whom looked eager to meet me. As I walked toward them, I could feel Daniel's eyes on my back, the weight of his gaze like a physical presence. I didn't turn around. James greeted me warmly, introducing me to the others in his circle, developers, architects, and preservationists who were all familiar with my work. They didn't need any introductions. They already knew who I was. It was strange how they treated me like an equal, like someone who had earned her place in their world. I was no longer the woman Daniel had introduced as just an architect. I was someone they admired, someone they respected. Daniel eventually joined us, but it was clear he was out of his element. He tried to interject into the conversation, but his words felt hollow, like they were meant to impress rather than contribute. The conversation turned to the Whitmore estate, and I found myself speaking with a confidence I hadn't known I possessed. I explained the restoration challenges we had faced, the structural issues we had overcome, and the unique features we had worked to preserve. They listened intently, asking questions, engaging with me on a level Daniel had never been able to. I saw his discomfort growing with every word I spoke. At one point, I glanced over at him, just for a second, and I saw the way his face tightened. His smile had disappeared, replaced with an expression I couldn't quite place. It wasn't just the surprise of the evening, it was something deeper, something I had never seen before. He was uncomfortable with me, with the version of me that was finally being recognized, finally being seen for who I was and what I had achieved. I didn't feel sorry for him. I should have, but I didn't. It wasn't the first time he had shown me that he didn't fully understand me, that he had always seen my work as secondary to his. But now, in this moment, I saw clearly that he had never truly seen me at all. He had only seen the version of me that he had created in his mind, the one that fit neatly into his narrative, and that version of me no longer existed. The evening wore on, but I couldn't stop thinking about the shift I had felt, the way the guests responded to me, the way Daniel had been left behind in the conversation, trying desperately to insert himself but failing. I had spent so long trying to shrink myself down, trying to fit into a world that wasn't mine. But tonight, I had allowed myself to stand tall, to be who I was. And for the first time, I realized I didn't need his approval to be enough. I was enough on my own. It wasn't until much later, when the dinner was winding down, and the guests began to say their goodbyes, that I found myself standing alone in the foyer. Daniel had disappeared into a conversation with a potential business partner, his back to me as I stood quietly, reflecting on the evening. The house was quiet now, the air cooler as the last few guests filed out. I could hear the sound of footsteps approaching, and when I looked up, it was James Whitmore again, his friendly face smiling at me. "Well, Lucy," he said, his voice warm and sincere, "I have to tell you, I've heard nothing but good things about you tonight. Your work, your expertise, it's clear you're not just another architect. You're making history." I felt a flush of warmth spread through me, a strange mix of pride and disbelief. For so long, I had hidden my achievements, quietly pretending that they didn't matter. But in this moment, surrounded by people who saw the value in what I had done, I finally understood. I wasn't just another architect. I was someone who had built a legacy, and I wasn't going to let anyone, including Daniel, take that away from me. "Thank you, James," I said, my voice steady and clear. "It means a lot to hear that." He smiled and patted my shoulder gently. "It's the truth, Lucy. Keep doing what you're doing. You're changing the landscape of preservation, one building at a time." As he walked away, I couldn't help but feel a sense of finality. Something had shifted inside me tonight, something that could never be undone. I wasn't just a supporting character in Daniel's story anymore. I was the one writing my own. And for the first time, I was ready to see where that story would take me. The drive back to the hotel was silent, but the air between Daniel and me was thick with something unspoken. I had expected him to say something, anything, about the evening, about the guests, about how I had been treated like an equal for the first time in our marriage. But the only sound in the car was the hum of the engine, the occasional whoosh of the tires on the highway. He was gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white, his jaw set in a way that made it clear he was angry, though he hadn't said a word. I glanced over at him, watching the tension in his profile. He looked almost like a stranger to me now. For years, I had justified his condescending remarks, his casual dismissals of my work. I had told myself it was just his way, that he didn't understand the pressure I faced in my field, the long hours, the exhaustion that came with managing a historic preservation project. But tonight, standing in that room with people who actually saw me for who I was, I couldn't pretend anymore. I had spent so long making myself small, shrinking down to fit into a version of our life that wasn't even mine, and for what? So he could feel better about himself. So he could be the one in the spotlight. I shifted in my seat, my hands folded tightly in my lap. The silence felt suffocating, like a weight pressing on my chest. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I turned to him, my voice steady but carrying a weight I hadn't expected. "Are we just going to pretend nothing happened tonight?" I asked, the question hanging in the air between us. He glanced over at me, his eyes briefly meeting mine before darting back to the road. "What do you mean?" His voice was clipped, tight. "You saw how they treated me, didn't you?" I wasn't asking for validation. It was a statement. Something that had been building up inside me for years. "You saw how James spoke to me. You heard how they reacted when they found out what I've accomplished. Why do you think they wanted to meet me? It wasn't because I was your wife. It was because I'm good at what I do. Daniel didn't respond right away. His grip on the wheel tightened even more. His jaw clenched so hard, I could see the muscles in his neck bulging. His eyes stayed fixed on the road, and for a moment, I thought he wasn't going to say anything at all. I know you don't understand what I do, I continued, my voice rising slightly. But what I don't get is why you've never even tried. You've never asked about my work, not really. You've never asked how I managed to save a building, how much effort it took, how much of myself I poured into it. Instead, you've treated me like I'm some kind of accessory, like I don't matter unless I fit into your world. He started, but his words faltered. He took a deep breath, then exhaled slowly, as if trying to steady himself. I never said you didn't matter. Really? I almost laughed, but it came out bitter. Then, why does it feel like I've been invisible in our marriage? Why do you think I've spent 3 years pretending to be someone I'm not? Someone who doesn't have a career, Someone who doesn't have her own life outside of you. The words had spilled out before I could stop them. It wasn't just the evening, the dinner, or the way I had finally been seen for who I truly was. It was everything. It was the years of sacrifice, the constant need to shrink myself to make him feel better, to keep the peace. The anger had been building for so long, and now it was finally spilling over. I don't know what you want me to say, Lucy, he said, his voice low, but with an edge that made my chest tighten. I've always supported you. I've always been there. You never asked for help. I shook my head, unable to hold back the frustration. It's not about asking for help, Daniel. It's about you never even seeing me. You've never cared to understand who I am. What drives me? You've never cared about my career, my achievements, unless it somehow made you look good. There was a long pause before he spoke again, his words slow and deliberate. You're saying this is my fault. I didn't know how to answer him. Was it his fault? Maybe, but it didn't matter anymore. I wasn't looking for blame. I was just looking for him to see me, to finally acknowledge the person I had become. No, I said softly, the anger leaving me as quickly as it had come. I'm saying I'm done pretending. The words hung in the air between us, and I watched as his expression shifted, his features softening, his gaze shifting to the road. I didn't know what he was thinking, but for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the need to guess. We pulled into the parking lot of the hotel, the headlights casting long shadows on the pavement. The car came to a stop, but neither of us moved. I stared at the dashboard, the tension between us thick and uncomfortable. You don't have to say anything, I said, my voice quieter now. I just needed you to understand. To know that I'm not the woman you think I am. I'm not just your wife. I have my own life, my own identity. And I'm not going to hide it anymore. I waited for him to respond, but the silence stretched on, deeper than it had ever been before. Finally, I opened the door and stepped out, leaving him behind in the car. As I walked toward the hotel, I realized I wasn't walking away from him, not exactly. I was walking toward something else, toward the life I had denied myself for far too long. The hotel lobby was quiet, the soft hum of a distant conversation, the only sound as I passed the front desk. I could feel the weight of the evening, the weight of the realization that tonight had changed everything. I didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time in years, I felt like I was finally moving in the right direction. The morning after the dinner felt surreal. The quiet of the hotel room was almost deafening. I woke up before dawn, my mind racing, turning over everything that had happened the night before. The way the guests had looked at me, the way Daniel had withdrawn into himself, and the way I had finally seen myself clearly. It had been the first time in so long that I felt seen, but also the first time I felt the full weight of what I had been sacrificing all these years. The night had exposed something I couldn't ignore anymore. Daniel's inability to truly understand me. To see me for who I was beyond the image of the woman who was supposed to support his ambitions. I had become so used to being invisible in his eyes, so used to fitting into the mold he had created for us, that I had almost forgotten who I was. But now, standing on my own, I realized that I couldn't go back. I couldn't shrink myself to fit his version of what our life should be. I tried to shake off the tension that had settled in my chest. The feeling of uncertainty about what would come next was overwhelming. But in the midst of it, I knew one thing: I was done pretending. I was done being the version of myself that Daniel had built in his mind. I was ready to be the person I had always been, the person I had hidden from everyone, including myself. I dressed quickly and headed down to the lobby. The cool morning air hit my face as I stepped outside. The city was still waking up, the streets almost empty, save for a few early risers. I walked for a while, my mind still spinning with thoughts of what had happened. The conversations from the dinner played over and over in my head. The recognition I had received. The way the guests had treated me like an equal, like someone worth their time and respect. I felt a strange sense of empowerment, but also a deep sadness. It was painful to realize how much of myself I had buried. Just to keep the peace with Daniel. Just to keep up with the facade of our marriage. By the time I reached the cafe, I was lost in my thoughts. I ordered a coffee and sat by the window, staring out at the world outside. The cafe smelled of freshly baked pastries and strong coffee, a comforting scent that grounded me. But even as I sipped the hot drink, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The silence between Daniel and me had grown so heavy over the past few weeks that I wondered if there was anything left to say. When I returned to the hotel room, Daniel was already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, his clothes neatly folded on the chair beside him. He looked up when I entered, his eyes meeting mine. For a moment, there was nothing but quiet tension, neither of us knowing how to break the silence. "I think we need to talk," he said finally, his voice tight, guarded. I nodded, my chest tightening. I had known this conversation was coming, but now that it was here, I didn't know how to begin. How could I explain to him the depths of my frustration? How could I make him understand that I had been drowning for years, suffocating under the weight of his expectations, his need to control how I fit into his world? But instead of launching into the conversation, I had rehearsed in my mind. I took a deep breath and spoke the words that had been building up inside me for far too long. "I'm not the woman you think I am." I said quietly, my voice steadied the storm swirling inside me. Daniel didn't respond right away. He just stared at me, as if trying to process what I had said. I could see the wheels turning in his mind, the way he was calculating his next move. I had always known he was strategic, always thinking a few steps ahead. But tonight, for the first time, I wasn't playing by his rules. I've been pretending, I continued, my voice rising slightly. Pretending that I'm happy in a marriage where I'm not seen. Pretending that I'm okay with you treating me like I'm just your wife and not my own person. I'm done pretending. I watched his face change as I spoke, his expression flickering between confusion and frustration. What do you mean? Done pretending. I've always supported you. You know that. No, I said, shaking my head. You've tolerated me. You've tolerated my work when it didn't interfere with your plans. But you've never really supported me. Not the way I've needed it. The silence stretched between us, both of us standing in this heavy moment, unsure of what to say next. I could see him struggling to find the right words, but he couldn't seem to understand. He wasn't ready to hear what I was saying. Not yet. And maybe he never would be. I can't do this anymore, Daniel, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I can't keep pretending that I'm happy in a marriage where I'm invisible. I'm not just your wife. I'm me. And if you can't see that, then I don't know where we go from here. There was a long pause, the weight of my words hanging between us. For a moment, I thought he might say something, anything. But he didn't. He just stared at me, his expression unreadable. And I knew, without a doubt, that he didn't understand. He never had. I didn't wait for him to speak. Instead, I turned and walked toward the door, my heart racing in my chest. I wasn't sure what I was doing anymore, but I knew one thing for certain. I was no longer going to be the person I had been. I was no longer going to let him define me. I stepped out of the hotel room, feeling the cool morning air on my skin. I didn't know where I was going, but it didn't matter. For the first time in years, I felt like I was finally taking control of my own life. I spent the next few days in a daze. Each moment felt like a quiet echo of the conversation I'd had with Daniel. Each step away from him a little further into a life that had always been mine, but had somehow gotten lost along the way. I didn't go home right away. I couldn't. Instead, I found myself walking the city streets, the familiar skyline a backdrop to the unfamiliar, feeling growing inside me. I had always thought that leaving would be the hardest part, but it wasn't. The hardest part was realizing that I had been holding on to someone who couldn't see me, couldn't understand the person I was becoming. It was on the third day, after I left, that I received a message from Alina. It was simple, just a few words that felt like a lifeline. I'm here when you're ready. You don't have to do this alone. I smiled as I read it, the tension in my chest loosening just a little. Alina had always been my rock, the person who knew me better than anyone else. She had been there, through the years of doubt, the frustrations of my career, and the emotional toll of being in a marriage that never truly saw me. I called her later that day. I'm coming over, I said, my voice steady for the first time in days. I think I'm ready to talk. When I arrived at her apartment, she greeted me with a hug. The warmth of her embrace grounding me, in a way that no amount of thinking or wandering through the city could. We settled into the couch. The familiar scent of her coffee, brewing in the kitchen, filling the space between us. "So, what's next?" she asked gently, her voice full of concern but also determination. I leaned back, closing my eyes for a moment. "I don't know yet," I admitted. "But I'm finally starting to see what I've been avoiding for so long." "Which is?" she pressed, her tone soft but insistent. "That I've been holding on to this image of who I thought I was supposed to be. For him. For everyone." I opened my eyes and met her gaze. "I've spent so much of my life fitting into someone else's idea of who I should be that I forgot to ask myself what I really wanted. What I need." Elena nodded, her eyes full of understanding. "You've always been so much more than that." "I know. But it took me leaving to realize how much I've been hiding. How much I've let myself shrink down to fit into this tiny space that Daniel made for me." I paused, my voice catching slightly. "I didn't think I was allowed to be more than just East's wife." "Elena," I continued, "I've been working on these projects, these incredible restorations, but he's never seen any of it. Not really. It's always been about him. And I let it be." Elena's voice was calm, but there was a fire beneath her words. "You are so much more than that. You always have been. And he never saw it. But you're seeing it now. You're starting to see the person you've been all along." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. She was right. I wasn't just his wife. I was an architect, a creator. A woman who had spent years building something far more valuable than the life Daniel had tried to shape for me. I had spent years building my career, my legacy, and yet, I had almost let it all slip away. But now what? I asked, the question hanging in the air like a weight. I don't know what to do next. I don't know where to go from here. Elena didn't hesitate. You keep going. You keep building. You keep doing the work you've always done, but this time, you do it for you, not for him, not for anyone else. I smiled at her, grateful for her unwavering support. You're right. Over the next few days, I focused on myself. I revisited my projects. The ones I had put on hold, while I was trying to fix a relationship that was beyond saving. I started to see them with fresh eyes, not as obligations but as accomplishments. The Whitmore estate, the theater restoration, the textile mill conversion, all of it was my work. I had put my heart and soul into those projects, and I was damn proud of them. I was proud of myself. But as I dove into the work, something unexpected happened. I started receiving calls from clients and colleagues who had been at the dinner. They were reaching out, wanting to collaborate, wanting to work with me on new projects. It was surreal, this sudden wave of recognition. One afternoon, while I was working on a new blueprint, my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen and saw a message from James Whitmore. My heart skipped a beat as I opened it. Lucy, I hope you're doing well. I wanted to follow up on our conversation last night. There are several projects I'd love to discuss with you. Your expertise is exactly what we need. Let's set up a meeting soon. I stared at the message for a moment, the words sinking in. James was reaching out, not just to compliment me, but to offer me opportunities. I had never imagined that one dinner could change everything. But in that moment, I realized that it wasn't just the dinner. It was me finally taking control of my life and stepping into the person I had always been meant to be. The next few days were a blur. I met with James, and we discussed several new projects, each one more exciting than the last. The opportunities were endless, and for the first time, I felt like I was in control. I was building something that was mine, not just for me, but for the people who had recognized my value, who had seen my work for what it was. And then, just as I was starting to feel like I was on the right path, I received another message, this one from Daniel. I opened it cautiously, unsure of what to expect. "I'm sorry. I've been thinking about everything, and I realize now how much I took you for granted. I want to make this right. Please, let's talk." For a moment, I felt a pang of something I couldn't quite name. Regret. Sadness. But then I remembered the conversation we had in the car, the silence that followed, and the realization that had settled in me. I didn't need to go back. I didn't need to try to fix something that had been broken for so long. I set the phone down, taking a deep breath. I wasn't going to respond, not now, not ever. This was my life now, and I wasn't going to let anyone else control it. I picked up the phone again, opened the message, and typed simply, "I'm not coming back, Daniel. I'm moving forward." I hit send, and the weight I had been carrying for so long lifted off my shoulders. I didn't need his approval. I didn't need his validation. I had everything I needed right here, within me. I closed my eyes for a moment, taking in the peace that washed over me. It wasn't about revenge, about proving something to him. It was about freedom. It was about being me, for the first time in years. And as I looked out the window, watching the city come to life, I knew that whatever came next, I was ready for it. The months after the divorce were a blur, but also a period of surprising clarity. I had no idea how long it would take to heal, to regain the sense of self I had lost. But little by little, I began to feel whole again. Each day brought new challenges, new opportunities, and with each one, I realized how much I had been holding back, how much I had been limiting myself just to fit into a life that wasn't truly mine. I was busy, but the kind of busy that felt right. My work was flourishing in a way I hadn't expected. New projects were coming in, clients were asking for my expertise, and the recognition that had once seemed so distant was now tangible. People were reaching out for advice, for consultations. I had become a sought-after architect, and it felt like I was finally stepping into the life I had always dreamed of, but had never fully allowed myself to embrace. One afternoon, after a particularly successful meeting with a new client, I found myself walking through the streets of the city, the sun warm on my face. It was a feeling I hadn't experienced in years, freedom. Not just the freedom from my past relationship, but the freedom to be exactly who I was without apology. As I passed by one of the newer renovations I'd been involved with, a small smile tugged at my lips. The building had once been run down, neglected, forgotten. Now, it stood proudly, a symbol of everything I had accomplished. It was a testament to what could happen when someone saw potential where others only saw decay. It felt like a quiet affirmation of my worth, of everything I had worked for. The phone buzzed in my pocket, pulling me from my thoughts. It was a text from James Whitmore. "Lucy, I hope this finds you well. I've been thinking about some of the projects we discussed. I'm excited to get started. Let's set up a time to meet soon. I couldn't help the smile that spread across my face. James had been one of the first people to recognize my skills, to value what I brought to the table. He had treated me like a colleague from the start, and his respect had been one of the key factors in my new confidence. I texted him back, agreeing to meet the following week to discuss the details further. As I continued my walk, I couldn't help but think about everything that had led me here. The journey had been long, filled with emotional twists and turns, but I had finally found my footing. For so long, I had been trying to build a life for someone else, trying to fit into a mold that didn't suit me. But now, I was building my own life, one that reflected who I truly was, not who I had been told to be. I thought about Daniel, about how he had once been the center of my world. There were moments when I still felt a pang of sadness, but it was no longer the crippling sorrow it once had been. It had been replaced with something else, a quiet resolve, the understanding that the life I had imagined with him had never been what I needed. I had always been capable of so much more than he had given me credit for. I had always been strong, independent, and passionate about my work. But I had allowed myself to be confined by the expectations of a relationship that had never truly supported me. I had spent years minimizing myself, dimming my light just to make him feel more secure. But now, I was learning to shine on my own terms. As I walked past another building I had worked on, the thought struck me. This was my life now. It was mine to build, mine to shape, and no one else's. I had done the hard work, the work that others had dismissed, and I was finally reaping the rewards. The freedom to be myself, to do what I loved, was something I would never take for granted again. That evening, as I sat in my apartment, sipping a glass of wine and looking out at the city, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. I wasn't running from anything anymore. I wasn't hiding who I was. I was simply living, fully and unapologetically. A knock at the door startled me. I stood up, surprised. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened it, I found Alina standing on the other side, a wide grin on her face. You look like you've been carrying the world on your shoulders for far too long, she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. How does it feel to finally put it down? I laughed, the sound light and free, like the first breath in years. I admitted. She looked around at the space I had created, at the life I had built for myself. I'm proud of you, she said, her voice soft but full of meaning. I'm proud of me too, I replied, the words feeling more solid than they ever had before. As we sat down, chatting about life, projects, and the future, I realized something important. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. And no one, not even Daniel, could take that away from me. The phone buzzed again, pulling me out of my thoughts. This time, it was a message from Daniel. It was simple. I've been thinking a lot, I'm sorry for everything. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I stared at the message for a moment, letting it sink in. The apology was nice, but it didn't change anything. I had moved on. I had to. I deleted the message without replying. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the weight of the past lift completely. I wasn't waiting for anything anymore. I wasn't waiting for approval, for validation, or for a life that never truly fit. I was building the life I deserved. And nothing was going to stop me. I looked out the window again, watching the city lights flicker as the night settled in. This was just the beginning.